Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone to this monthly edition of the NSTS Hydrogeophysics webinar. And today we'll dive into our seminar series, the career path in hydrogeophysics, and we are honored to have our guest speaker, Dr. Klaus Holliger. Klaus Holliger received his MSc and PhD degrees in geophysics from ETH Zurich, and as well as his postgraduate degrees in economics from University of London. And after his postdoc at Rice University, he rejoined ETH Zurich and then moved to the chaired professorship at the University of Lausanne. Dr. Holliger holds the adjunct professorship at both ETH Zurich and Zhejiang University. He has received numerous awards, notably the SCG Erasmuni Award, the Frank Frischnet Award, and also the Distinguished Service Award. He was the 2022 SCG Honorary Lecturer, Europe, and then served as the president of this near-surface geophysics session. And also, he served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Applied Geophysics. Dr. Holliger has been the co-editor of several books and also several issues, and is broadly interested and has been active in varieties of domains, including ocean acoustics, lithospheric geophysics, which I believe we hear a lot of today, and also during these past 2 decades, his primary focus has been his research interest in hydrogeophysics. So without any further ado, I would open the floor to Dr. Holliger and tell us about his career path in hydrogeophysics. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Moses, for this introduction. And I really greatly appreciate this invitation, as it gave me an opportunity to reflect on my journey. And doing so, I realized actually how coincidental, if not random, it was. So this lends itself best to a storytelling approach, and shall start with my tender beginnings. I was born in 1962, so a fairly long time ago, and mostly grew up with my grandparents, who operated a small farm, which you can see here on the left in a renovated state, more recent state, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. Most of the work was done by hand, and my grandmother was still cooking on a wood stove. So I had a very, very good relationship with my grandfather, and this sort of really eased myself into that humble and humbling lifestyle that we had there, which was essentially governed by the course of the seasons, the daily weather, and the daylight. It was not uncommon that I skipped school when all hands were needed. For example, when bringing in hay ahead of thunderstorms, and correspondingly, I was really not particularly scholastic. I nevertheless managed to eventually graduate from high school, and after that, I spent the next year doing my military service, which was strictly compulsory at the time. Now, military life was really not my cup of tea, but the good thing about it was that it really, the conviction, it led me to the conviction that I wanted to do something sensible with my life afterwards. And so I ended up, I signed up to the basic science program at ETH Zurich. My original idea was to study geology, which was the reason for which was that early on I had sort of grown interested in rocks, fossils, and minerals that I came around strolling around. And I was particularly fascinated by the minor but consistent amounts of placer gold that the local streams carried. Going to ETH was definitely a very good decision, as the basic training in maths, physics, and chemistry were absolutely formidable. Moreover, this was a period where computer science education started to be democratized, and I had never seen a computer before, and therefore was particularly fascinated by this. So I started taking a lot of numerical math and coding classes, and so in the end this led to me becoming a geophysicist, which is sort of, I found, was a good balance between my original interest in geology and my newly discovered quantitative inclinations. The next good thing that happened to me is that I got the stipend to do my master's thesis at Imperial College. And that was, I'd never been to the UK before, but I really enjoyed my time there, and sort of getting to know the Anglo-Saxon academic culture was a true revelation. What I was supposed to be doing is to look at CSAT altimetry data and to convert those data to gravity, marine gravity anomalies, to see whether one could sort of use these kinds of data to constrain the lithospheric structure of the North Sea rift systems. It turned out these data were insufficient for this purpose, and so I used marine gravity data instead. For this, I moved to the University of Cambridge and worked with Simon Klemperer, whom you see here, and who became afterwards a professor at Stanford. Simon was a really great supervisor, not just for doing science and for learning about the scientific method, but particularly also for properly communicating it. Sort of writing my first paper with him was a really formative experience. After this, I moved, and some odd jobs in between. I moved back to ETH to do a PhD. At the time, there was sort of something like a pandemic, a scientific pandemic, which was related to probing all continents with controlled source seismic techniques. And I had my minor role in there during my PhD, which consisted in the processing and interpretation of a deep seismic reflection profile, which had been shot across the Central Alps. The resulting data ended up being much better and much more telling than I had originally expected. And this then, sort of based on the experience of my master's degree, allowed me to sort of build a well-constrained gravity model of the entire lithosphere asthenosphere system of the alpine collision zone. This model, for the first time, arguably unequivocally constrained the geometry of the subduction zone, which was associated with this alpine collision zone. And so, if I have any kind of claim to fame, it is that this picture here got actually reproduced subsequently in Bill Lowry's textbook's book, Fundamentals of Geophysics. Towards the end of my PhD, I was sort of unsure what to do with myself and with my life. And I felt particularly ambivalent about whether I should be staying in science or not. This changed very rapidly, and I met Alan Lewander, whom you see here on the top left, at the Deep Seismic Reflection meeting in Bayreuth, Germany. Alan convinced me in no time at all that I should be joining him as a postdoc at Rice University, which I did. Even though I had never been to the US or let alone to Houston before, this turned out to be a really great decision, and I ended up staying almost 4 years. During this time at Rice, my salary was paid by the Office of Naval Research, and I actually required a complete security clearance before I was able to start working there. The reason for this was that Alan had gotten into one of these major programs of the Office of Naval Research, which aimed at locating submarines over very large distances using low-frequency acoustic waves. Our role in this was to sort of the ocean acoustic modeling part. This was sort of technically very demanding, cutting-edge work, which was interesting, but in the end, in terms of the scientific output, it was relatively disappointing. The good part about this program was, however, that it brought together a large number of very diverse scientists, which led to very valuable cross-fertilizations. And Alan and I keenly picked those up and sort of transferred whatever we could to our to lithospheric geophysics, which was our true love and interest. And so one of these approaches, which really sort of changed things quite a bit for us, was a model building approach, which we had seen being used by the oceanographers in the program. So this was basically the geostatistics-based model building approach, where you sort of infer the geostatistical properties on a very small scale and then extend those basically build corresponding stochastics models at a very larger scale to sort of simulate things. And so the question at the time, which was sort of stirring the entire lithospherics community, was why the continental lower crust had such a high reflectivity, whereas the upper crust above it and the lower and the upper mantle below it were generally seismically transparent. And so to address this question in a semi-quantitative fashion, Alan and I decided to look at a cross-section, geological cross-sections from the Ivrea zone, which is one of the few locations on Earth where the lower crust has been brought to the surface, and to analyze these cross sections geostatistically and then build corresponding models, for which we then generated synthetic data. And the synthetic data, despite the fact that they really sort of looked very realistic, were sort of met with quite some resistances initially by the community, simply because it was an uncommon approach of doing things, at least in lithospheric geophysics. But eventually it got embraced, and we sort of were quite happy and productive doing similar stuff for quite a while. When I eventually started looking for a faculty job, I came to the sober realization that all these seemingly so prolific lithospheric geophysics programs that I had so far been involved in were all dying or had already died. And so on top of it, most of the new faculty jobs were advertised in near-surface geophysics. So I had to rebrand myself. And sort of eventually I found a job in the yet again back at ETH, but this was really again entirely coincidental. And my job was located under the newly created chair of environmental geophysics, for which Alan Green had been appointed to. Alan Green had himself been previously a very prominent lithospheric geophysicist at the Canadian Geological Survey. And so this may sound a little bit like the blind leading the blind, but and certainly in this 2020 hindsight, one could have done certain things better or faster. But overall, it turned out reasonably well. And particularly Alan, during the 20 years he was active in near-surface geophysics, had, in my view, a very defining influence on the field. So I decided to sort of take it easy and ease myself my way into this new domain by simply transferring what I was doing, pretty much transferring the methodologies I had been applying at the lithospheric scale to the shallow subsurface. And so, for example, here you see sort of a finite difference solution of the viscoelastic wave equation that is that was used to simulate source-generated noise in near-surface seismic data. So I did the same thing for ground-penetrating radar, and notably also for ground-penetrating radar antenna systems. This research was fun, and it had its place because very little at the time had been done on this topic. At the same time, I must admit, it took a rather long time to dim on me that many of the phenomena that I was actually modeling, in these near-surface seismic and ground-penetrating radar data were governed by the presence or absence of water. The study that probably finally pushed the lever over was our work on guided waves. Guided waves are these kind of reverberatory wave trains, denoted here in this figure as G, which are following the direct direct P wave. And looking a little bit closer at these data, it turned out that many of the, or most of the data that I was looking at actually were that the waveguide consisted of the unsaturated zone, which whose lower bound evidently then was the groundwater table. And so you could construct a corresponding inversion scheme, which would sort of provide the parameters of the Vado zone as well as its thickness and the parameters of the aquifer below. So this was sort of something that that caused the first interest, or with which I managed to get sort of a first interest from the hydrogeological side in the kind of work I was doing. And this then sort of from then onwards, I sort of moved gradually into what is known today as hydrogeophysics. And this process got accelerated by the fact that I was co-supervising a PhD student who did who did really a dedicated thesis on this. This was Hendrik Pasche. His objective was to use diverse geophysical data and integrate them with hydraulic data to sort of hydrogeologically characterize the subsurface. The approach that he was primarily using was is so-called cluster analysis, which is quite simple in the sense of that you simply cross-plot all the data that you have. You try to identify coherent groups, and then you map the corresponding mean values and standard deviations back into the model space. So this is illustrated here in this picture for where like that we identified the high permeability zone in a very heterogeneous alluvial aquifer. The underlying data were electrical resistivity tomography, as well as a few hydraulic conductivity profiles based on direct push probing. At the time when Hendrik finished his PhD in 2006, I was already no longer at ETH. Indeed, I had already moved almost a year ago. And I had gone to the University of Lausanne then in 2005. And the more honest ones and outspoken ones amongst my colleagues at ETH had explicitly warned me not to do this, because they said there was way more administration, way more teaching, and way less in internal funding compared to ETH. And on top of it, many of the colleagues would be really complicated. However, I was really motivated to do something new, and I was absolutely charmed by the surroundings. And so I was just not really thinking too hard about this. Now, almost 20 years later, I can sort of safely say that this worked out really well, but there were definitely some road bumps on the way. And so the first one came across when we finally had a new hiring in geophysics. And to my big surprise, the entire committee, apart from me, wanted to appoint a local boy, which in my view was absolutely not fit for the job. And so I put up a really big fight, and this turned really ugly over a period of 2 years until sort of the university president stepped in and made an executive decision to appoint Niklas Linde, who happened to be my first rated candidate. With this, I had learned a lesson or two in academic politics, and the next hirings then went quite smoothly. So we then appointed James Irving. Shortly afterwards, James had been previously my first postdoc in Lausanne, and then moved temporarily to an assistant professorship in Canada. And finally, we also appointed Beatrice Quintal, who is more into rock physics. So this sort of formed a nice, reasonably well-focused and well-tuned applied geophysics group, which still happily exists and functions in its original composition. So in addition to building the group, the first 10 years in Lausanne were really quite busy. It started with a tenure as vice dean of research, and I got roped into this office by my naive belief that like this I could be participating in corresponding strategic discussions at the school or at the university level. Instead, I got saddled with the first ever evaluation of the school. And such evaluations are not that difficult to do if you can do them on standard normative criteria. However, we had a fairly large number of human geographers in our school who sort of absolutely refused to proceed like this, and so the evaluation had to do non-normatively, which was unsatisfactory and quite messy. Afterwards, I did 2 stints in at the executive level, and even there things were well, I liked it better because I had my hands directly in the money pot. But even there, things were not easy because in the meantime the school had started a relatively ill-conceived restructuring process, which of course fully hit me in at this kind of level. In addition to this, I was during most of these 10 years, the first 10 years, I was the editor of the Journal of Applied Geophysics. Even though this was mostly an administrative task as well, I quite enjoyed it, and I thought I really learned quite a lot during this period. One can say a lot of bad things about the large publishing houses, but personally I had relatively good experiences always with Elsevier. They were sort of disarmingly honest with regard to their economic objectives, and they were incredibly supportive to their editors, particularly with regard to providing training and education. The latter then actually formed the basis for scientific writing and publishing course, which I put together and taught in China from 2016 until the onset of the pandemic. Finally, on a more personal level, but also quite important, my 2 sons were born shortly after my arrival in Lausanne. And since I had never really gotten to know my father, I decided to be sort of active and involved in this role. This worked out remarkably well. We developed a good and close relationship to this day, which manifests itself, amongst many other things, by the fact that I infected them both with the fishing virus, which is uncurable and which I myself had also caught as a very little kid from my grandfather. Here you see a relatively recent picture of them together with their mother in the middle, who in the end, after resisting for a long time, also caved in order not to be the odd one left out. Yes, research-wise, of course, this quite surprisingly, actually, at least in retrospect, this period was also quite productive research-wise. In fact, it probably was one of my most productive periods, which was evidently not my own doing, but rather the doing of the great people I was involved in. By that time, I had definitely arrived in hydrogeophysics, and I was pursuing 3 slightly different avenues. The first one was concerned with basic stochastic simulations, where you use sort of the hydraulic data normally acquired along boreholes as the hard conditioning data and the generally geophysical tomographic images as soft constraints. Here you see a corresponding example from the Boise Hydrogeophysical Research Site, where we use sort of neutron porosity logs and cross-hole ground penetrating radar data or tomographic images. And this work was done by Baptiste Dafflon, my first PhD student in Lausanne, who is now a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley lab. So this worked out quite well as long as you worked on a small scale, where the the difference in resolution between the geophysical data and the borehole data was not too large. Going to a larger scale, however, and that's where something like that, evidently approaches like that would be particularly useful, things started to fall apart. And it was then sort of my colleague and friend Erwan Gloagin, whom you see here at the bottom left, from the Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique, INRS, in Quebec City, who sort of conceived a workflow based on a Bayesian approach, which managed to resolve that problem. Erwan, together with James Irving and myself, then supervised a PhD student, Paolo Ruggeri, who brought this all to fruition. And here you can see an application of the final methods to a remarkably long profile. I mean, it's approximately 300 meters. One can speak of something like the sub-regional sub-regional scale, and the data were the constraining geophysical data were essentially electrical resistivity tomography, and we had a few sort of hydraulic conductivity measurements, again from direct probing along. At the bottom, you see sort of the conditioning, the control data that we kept for this purpose. That these are the red lines, the hydraulic conductivities. The other lines are the simulated data around it. And as you can sort of see, it worked out remarkably nicely given the low resolution that the electrical resistivity data had. Another path that I pursued in hydrogeophysics was related to the work I had done with James Irving on the geostatistical inversion of seismic reflection and ground penetrating radar images. We had shown that it was possible to extract some key geostatistical properties of the probed subsurface from such images, which in turn then opened the pathway of using such non-tomographic geophysical, surface-based geophysical data for stochastic simulation purposes. And here you see a corresponding application, relatively recent, from Xi-Wei Xu, who was visiting a PhD student of James Irving and myself. So what Xi-Wei did here is that he sort of did a stochastic simulation of the three-dimensional porosity structure of the Boise Hydrogeophysical Research Site, and this as conditioning data used again sort of the neutron porosity logs of the borehole, and the soft geophysical data in this case was the surface-based common offset 3D georadar survey at the 100 megahertz for details. So what he did is first he sort of inferred the geostatistical characteristics of the volume from the surface-based ground penetrating radar data, and then he correspondingly stochastically inverted for the porosity structure in the process, always simulating the 3D data. Evidently, we could not solve numerically Maxwell's equations for each ground penetrating radar trace, and so we used a simple convolutional approach. And to our big surprise, this worked out remarkably well, as you can sort of see here by this comparison of the observed data at the top and the corresponding simulated data for one of the accepted models at the bottom. So the fact that this worked so well then inspired another student whom James and I also supervised jointly, Yu Liu, to develop a corresponding deterministic approach to estimate the detailed superficial electromagnetic velocity distribution. And for this, he basically used an approach that isolated the diffracted part of the wave field and the reflected parts of the wave field. He used the diffracted part to estimate the large-scale velocity structure and the reflected part for the small-scale velocity fluctuations. This probably experience by now shows that this may not work everywhere, but it worked quite beautifully at the Boise Hydrogeophysical Research Site here on a ground penetrating radar profile, and where we had sort of the neutron porosity logs along the profile as control data. Now, at least having the option to derive the detailed electromagnetic velocity structure from surface-based common offset GPR reflection data, that opens fantastic perspectives, which evidently go way beyond just water content estimation. And finally, the third avenue in hydrogeophysics that I pursued was related to poroelasticity. Well, poroelasticity allows you to relate the seismic velocity dispersion and the seismic attenuation to the fluid flow that is induced by the deformation, by the seismic deformation of saturated porous medium. And it took us quite a while to get to this point and to get it actually to work. But in the end, we were able to demonstrate that it was possible to reliably estimate actually the permeability of alluvial aquifers from the velocity dispersion of full waveform sonic logs. This research was quite instrumental, as it led to my group being invited to join a newly founded competence center. It was called the Swiss Competence Center for Energy Research, and these competence centers tend to be very generously funded, generally over a relatively long period of time. And so our role in there was to figure out whether it was possible to characterize the hydraulic properties of fractured deep geothermal reservoirs through seismic techniques. I mean, this led to a really flood of very, very nice research. It was an incredibly interesting and productive time, but ultimately none of the techniques none of the work we did sort of could really be easily translated into something practical. Primary reason for that is that the effects that we were seeing, and we were seeing a lot of interesting effects of this, such as, for example, fracture connectivity, generally happened outside the practical seismic frequency band. There was, however, one important tangible result of all this research, and this was related to estimating fracture compliance from full waveform sonic log data. Well, the normal and shear compliances of fractures essentially quantify the deformation of a fracture in response to a given amount of applied stress that is applied perpendicular or parallel to the fracture plane. And as such, the compliances are, fracture compliance is an absolutely key geomechanical parameter that is required for the planning and execution of hydraulic stimulation or hydraulic fracturing experiments. Here, I don't want to bore you too much with the details. The corresponding picture is directly taken from my SCG abstract, which I submitted a few weeks ago. So what you see at the top is an acoustic televiewer log where we have identified the fractures that we want to analyze. Then you have the corresponding azimuths and tips of these fractures that are also estimated from this televiewer log. And below then you have the normal and shear compliances that are estimated from the corresponding sonic log data of along this unit. So yeah, this seems to be working rather well, and personally I expect that this will have some interesting applications down the line. Ultimately, you can do whatever you want, but somehow the past always catches up with you. And so a few years ago, I was asked to participate in an ICDP project that aimed at drilling the lower continental crust that was exposed in the Ivrea zone. So this was, of course, an interesting opportunity which I could impossibly pass up. And so this project finally got funded, and it's again sort of a very large scale project which reunites a lot of diverse scientists from all over the world, and it is really enjoyable to work in this kind of framework and exchange ideas. Our role so far in this project is that we are interested, and again, I don't want to bore you with details here, sort of about the relative contributions of layer-induced and intrinsic anisotropy in the lower continental crust, and corresponding implications for estimating lower crustal composition, geochemical composition from seismic data. So that is one axis that we are pursuing, and the other axis will look a little bit more familiar. We are in the Ivrea zone, sounds familiar, have already been there with Alan Levander, already sort of analyzed geological cross-sections. So here we have one of these detailed geological maps from the Ivrea zone, of which we are cutting out segments that we are using as training data, and then for generating then larger scale geological models. Time has passed, however, almost 30 years since I did the work with Alan Levander, and technology allows us now to do much fancier things and much than we were working there at the time. So for now, we are mostly using multi-point geostatistics, which is also already no longer that young, but works out remarkably nicely and robustly. And increasingly, we are also looking into generative AI approaches. The picture that you're seeing here is indeed from a generative AI approach. So given that I shall be reaching the local mandatory retirement age in 3 years, this is most likely to be my last larger scale project. And so my career will pretty much end the way it has started, that is in lithospheric, mostly in lithospheric geophysics. So what can be learned from all this? Well, as I think I said it at the beginning, and I think I managed to convince everybody that a lot of my career path was a mixture between coincidence and luck. Mostly luck, I would sort of say. I really got lucky because things could have gone terribly wrong pretty much at any moment in time. So I would not really recommend this kind of meandering approach that I took for imitation, but if I could go back, there would still be a few things that I probably would be doing the same, and this would be getting a really good education in the basic sciences. That really was sort of capital stock that served me throughout my entire career, and also sort of allowed me to cushion the various kind of sort of changes in direction scientific direction that I undertook. So this is definitely something that is worth investing in. And then the other thing, that's a question whether it's luck or whether there was more to it. I had the incredible opportunity to work with inspired and inspiring people. Pretty much, I cannot really say that I met anybody or that I collaborated with anybody who was really just a drag on the system. Absolutely not. I sort of, this is sort of something that I can only, I do not know whether I can recommend it for imitation, because I do not know how it happened in my case, but that is sort of, I can just wish that to other people to happen. This was really sort of made a big difference in my life and in my career. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus. That was a great talk and a very good journey. And I would say I don't think it was random and lucky. You did a lot of things and you pursued them. So I totally disagree that it's just luck. And I agree that the good education is the start point. So people who want to, pursue a career in geophysics in general, a good education is the starting point, and I totally agree with that. So we have the question and answer box for you to attendees to ask your questions, but also you can raise your hand and we unmute you if you have any questions.
So this would be in the excuse me, this would be in the chat section, the question and answers.
No, it's a separate section. I will read them out. That we don't have any questions in there yet, but we have someone raising their hand. We can move on to the Q&A. We have a question from Hafiz asking, from your past experience and forecasting the future of the hydrogeophysics, what skills do you think students should start to acquire now as they're being students to have a successful career in hydrogeophysics?
Yeah, this is kind of this, as I sort of said, this is kind of a tall order. I mean, predicting the future is always very hard. But I would I think go back to what I have already sort of said, is that if you have a good training in math and physics in particular, then a lot of the things that we are actually doing in hydrogeophysics and that we have been doing and that we will be doing in the future are sort of can be learned relatively rapidly and reconciled relatively rapidly. I would not dare sort of to make predictions where the major future, the big future is going. Personally, if I can sort of, if I could go back and if I would sort of put an emphasis on a certain research that I did, I would probably sort of look again at these larger scale integration studies, catchment scale, where you have sort of either ERT or even airborne EM data and try to integrate those with conditioning data at much smaller scale that are sparse. So this definitely is sort of a point where hydrogeophysics could add incredible value once it is working out beyond the proof of concept. Another thing is that sort of this technique that this Chinese student Yu Liu has developed very recently. It is very intriguing, but I mean, it seems to have some instabilities. I was basically sort of saying it worked out great for the Boise Hydrogeophysical Research Site, worked out great for the synthetic data that he worked on, but then we've sort of tried to apply it to other data sets, and it wasn't a disaster, but it was not as brilliant as we had hoped. And so basically getting these kinds of techniques robust, because what does this allow us is that it's opening fantastic perspectives way beyond water content estimation. Well, if you can estimate the detailed velocity fluctuations, you can sort of really estimate, not just detect the presence of organic contaminants, for example, but actually estimate their amount from surface-based data. And so this would be a real game changer with regard, not necessarily hydrogeophysics, but with for contaminant geophysics. So this could be where one really makes a contribution. So these are the kind of things, the major things that I can be thinking of. And then evidently the last thing that I did is more geomechanical stuff. I think there is definitely bringing this to some kind of maturity would be an interest of myself, particularly we are sort of, when we are deriving something from sonic clock data, we are evidently looking in the kilohertz range, whereas sort of the hydraulic stimulation happens pretty much at the DC level, so at the quasi-static level. So figuring out sort of how the parameters are behaving in between would be an interesting, would definitely be an interesting game plan. So this is from a very, very personal perspective. I do not dare sort of predicting where the field is going.
So the next question is actually something that I also had. You mentioned there's some of the research that you have done, and there is it's difficult to find practicality for it and applied in practice. And Mana Cowman is asking for, as an ex-geophysicist and a current hydrologist, hydrogeologist, I despair somewhat at the lack of interest from the consultancy sector in the characterization of aquifer using geophysics, so basically hydrogeophysics, because there is no money in it. I would be interested to know how we can find practical applications of geophysics and get funding to do that, or basically, I think how we can show the hydrogeologist or hydrologist that hydrogeophysics can help them in their path to kind of characterize the water systems that we have.
Yeah, no, this is ultimately, I think it is, I have been thinking about this a lot. I mean, this was actually sort of something that I was sort of really, even though I was never, had never any aspiration of sort of really sort of going too practical or starting a company or anything. But the thing is, ultimately, it is the value of the commodity, how that is determining the price of the services that you're furnishing. And for example, if you do apply some of these techniques in the oil or in the minerals industry, I mean, there is definitely money in it. Whereas because there is evidently money to be made with it, whereas in hydrogeophysics and in engineering geophysics, the approach is quite often, well, there's not that much money in it, but it's also not that important. And until this changes, I think we will have a very hard time. Well, that's a very personal view, but I mean, we are using techniques that are not too different from those that are used, say, in the oil industry or in the minerals industry. And we are not behind technologically behind what these people are doing. The people working there, the geophysicists or the consultants working there, they're making good money. Whereas evidently, if you do it in environmental geophysics or in engineering geophysics, you're struggling. So then the conclusion is is for me relatively obvious, is that there needs to be sort of the underlying commodity needs to have a high enough value to make some money on it on the service side.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I know as research and practice are a little bit lagging, so it takes time for the research to kind of become practical for the people in practice. The next question is from Mustafa, who couldn't actually unmute himself, unfortunately, asking, integrating machine learning and geophysics, what are the possible pathways in the future, in your opinion? I guess hydrogeophysics.
Yeah. So I cannot, even though I sort of also got onto the a little bit onto the AI game. I mean, I had last year's SEG abstract. I had sort of an inversion, geostatistical inversional algorithm, which was originally a Monte Carlo algorithm, which we then sort of converted into a sort of AI-based image recognition algorithm. So there is definitely anything that is related to nonlinear inversion, their machine learning and AI has a potential in geophysics. So I think the applications are potentially vast, and I was actually really quite impressed by the extent to which, particularly in the near surface geophysics section last year, it had already been assimilated. So there seem to be people who are pretty much doing nothing else but detecting pipes with electromagnetics or magnetics, and then interpreting the corresponding data using AI, adding value to conventional interpretation using correspondingly trained AI systems. And so there is, I think, this will definitely change our field as much as it changes the entire applied geophysics domain.
Thank you. The next question is from Pai, asking, would like to get to know the relationship between faults and earthquakes, because I'm currently studying geophysics.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I was sort of bragging to be a lithospheric geophysicist, but I was always sort of on the controlled source side of things. So I have not really done earthquake seismology beyond evidently any kind of lectures I took in this domain. So yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure I should get started with explaining it, because there are probably plenty of people who can do better than me. But ultimately, yeah, an active seismic fault that has some tectonic strain on it will eventually sort of unlock. That means break the internal resistance due to the asperities and rugosities of the fault planes. And then the associated stress release is what we are noticing and measuring as an earthquake. So in the very, very simplest terms, this is the way I understand it.
Sounds great. The next question is, sorry that I may actually butcher the name, Ogachukwa. Sorry about that. Saying thank you for sharing your interest and your journey with us. I want to know that apart from a good basic education in math and physics and geophysics, what other attributes will one need to succeed in the career in hydrogeophysics as an early career student? So besides just learning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think sort of getting the basics down is evidently very valuable. Then a lot is, for example, a lot is sort of basically having sort of knowing what you want to be doing, and I cannot pretend that this was really the case for me. I was sort of until I sort of came up with the first faculty position, I was sort of not entirely sure where I would be ending up in the end. So, but I mean, sort of having a vision of what you want to do with your life is definitely a realistic vision of what you want to do with your life is definitely a very good ingredient to be successful later on in whatever profession, therefore also as a hydrogeophysicist. And for being a hydrogeophysicist or a geophysicist in general, eminently, yeah, the basic education, the importance of basic education in the sciences, but also in geophysics that we have talked about already on multiple occasions today are very important.
Thank you. And from Kevin asking, which is, I kind of understand it. I find it difficult to find research journals on hydrogeophysics or near-surface geophysics to publish that are ranking in a Q1 or Q2, or actually good journals with high impact factor. Can you suggest some, and what approach do you use to publish in high impact factor journals your research?
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a very pertinent question. I have sort of given the references here of the journals I was publishing in, and actually I think sort of, I can sort of say is that much of the stuff that we are doing, we are really aiming high. We are trying to get it into either a Journal of Geophysical Research or a notched-down Geophysical Journal International, and so on and so forth. And in general, we are reasonably successful with this. And I think sort of part of the success, evidently, you need to have some interesting story to tell, and then you need to tell it well. And if I may go back to what I said right at the beginning, and that is actually sort of something that is probably I did not stress enough, is that if I had I not sort of had this excursion to Cambridge and my experience with Simon Klemperer, who really sort of illustrated me the importance of scientific communication, things might have turned out differently. So this is really doing good research is one thing, and then but publishing is another thing. And sort of there are, unfortunately, there is a lot of very good research who for one or the other reason doesn't get published.
Thank you. And then I guess one last question from Bereket asking, what is the best advice to those individuals who are very keen in pursuing their PhD in the areas of applied geophysics or hydrogeophysics in general?
Yeah, well, follow your heart. I mean, it is sort of, it's a balance between going to the best possible school you can be going, or to the best advisor that you can possibly going, and doing the kind of research that you really love. I mean, being passionate about what you're doing, being really sort of into it, is ultimately half the way. So if you can do a boring project at the good school, or a really exciting one at the not so good school, I would probably, with 20/20 hindsight, go for the one that I was passionate about, because otherwise it becomes a drag and you may get fed up in the process.
I can't agree more with that.
So ideally, squaring the circle, great project at the great school for a PhD would evidently be ideal. That's the answer. Not always possible.
Right. We have a lot more questions in the chat. So we unfortunately we don't have time to answer these questions.
If you want, you can send them to me by email and I'll try to respond.
Yes, and also we have a Slack group that you can just ask them over there, and Klaus will answer over the Slack group. I'm
not on Slack. Sort of, I'm a bit old-fashioned, so I decided not to complicate my life more than absolutely necessary. But
okay,
if it's desired, I can join. Yes.
Well, we're trying to build a community over there. I'm
not criticizing. I'm not
Yeah.
not criticizing at all anything. I'm just saying that that's probably how you realize that I'm getting old. Yeah.
No. Yeah. I mean, email is just fine. So you can reach out directly to Klaus about your questions, or you can ask them on Slack, and I can convey them to him all at once and just get a response and put them back on Slack. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for this very beautiful talk, and you're talking about your career. Hopefully, we, the early career scientists, the students, will follow your path and get as successful as you are. We'll see in the future.
Well, I wish them as much. I wish them, as I said, sort of again, for that I go again back to the very end. I wish them as much luck as I had. I definitely had a lot of fun. But ultimately, yes. I mean, you need to sort of say it could have gone wrong at any point in time, and luck is also what you needed. So I would wish everybody a lot of fun, but most importantly, also a lot of luck.
Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Yeah, I hope that if my SEG abstract gets accepted, then I hope to see you at SEG certainly later this year.
Yes, looking forward to that.
So do I. Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank
you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.